Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Before we go to our guest today, Ben Weinthal, here is your JPC commercial. The JPC was founded in 1985 as a 501c3 organization, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. all spelled out, jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our insight articles, our magazine In Focus, our blog In Context. You can also find all of the previous webinars and all the wonderful guests who have agreed to be with us on the Jewish Policy Center. I especially recommend our latest guest, Thomas Jocelyn, on America's exit from Afghanistan. So all of that is on the website. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. So somebody asked me, why do you say that every week? The legitimacy and security of Israel. And it's because I really detest support Israel's right to exist. Thailand's right to exist is not questioned. Chile's right to exist is not questioned, nor should Israel's be. So that's why I do it. It is not about Israel's right to exist. It's about Israel's legitimacy and security. Thank you. As an organization that sits somewhat to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. Some of you have been with us from the beginning of these calls in early 2020, and you're familiar with my home office. This is my office, and you've joined us for programs on China, Israel, Turkey, domestic security, the defense budget, and the Supreme Court. And we took a look at the very short war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Today, we are back to Iran, specifically human rights in Iran, and specifically Navid Afkari, the Olympic wrestler executed by the Iranian regime, and the efforts in the West to keep his memory alive. Some of you have sent questions for our speaker. If you haven't and you have a question, please use the Q&A function on your screen and we'll be monitoring. So now our program. I am very pleased to introduce Ben Weinthal, a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a widely published journalist based in Berlin. He serves as FDD's eyes and ears in Europe. His investigative reporting has uncovered valuable information on Iran's energy links to European firms, which is another whole subject for another day. We're going to get him back here. And on Hamas and Hezbollah's terror finance operations in Europe. He has also examined the growth of Islamic State in Europe, growing anti-Semitism on the continent, and neo-Nazism. In his spare time, he covers Middle East affairs for the Jerusalem Post. I don't say this about many journalists these days, but Ben Weinthal is a journalist not to be missed. Aside from the Jerusalem Post, his work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal Europe, Slate, The Guardian, New Republic, National Review Online, Politico, New York Daily News, New York Post, and Haaretz. In Germany, his work has appeared in German newspapers whose names I am about to massacre: Frankfurter Rundschau, Berliner Morgenpost, and Der Tagesspiegel. Ben, you can correct me. If I had to say, I would say that the German government is not always happy to see his byline. He has also appeared on BBC and Fox News. So now, with the JPC, Ben Weinthal, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Shoshana, and for the invitation to speak today on the Jewish Policy Center's webinar. It's an honor, and the topic is obviously one that's been a pressing story for me for over a year, and it's a horrific story, but I'll spend 15-20 minutes and delving into the news I've gathered on the story and the meaning of Navid Afkari's case and life, both within Iran and outside of the Islamic Republic of Iran. as Shoshana mentioned, there's a format to ask questions, and I'm of the opinion that good questions are better than good answers, and I'll try to answer those questions. But I won't spend a lot of time on talking, because I think the case of Navid Afkari has captivated world attention, became a cause celeb in early September 2000, largely because I would argue a U.S. Olympic wrestler and former mixed martial artist by the name of, his name is Ben Askren from Wisconsin, tweeted a few of my Jerusalem Post stories. My first story that appeared in late August, which was one of the first story in the Middle East about Navid Afkari, and the first story in a print publication about Navid Afkari. And I should say, by way of background, I suspect I had some skin in the game, so to speak, because I was a former collegiate wrestler at New York University and a New York wrestler in New York State, and I was an All-American wrestler at New York University. So wrestling's been has been a longstanding passion of mine. So this story I saw on Twitter initially. An Iranian, a British Iranian actress first tweeted the story, I think in August, and I wrote about the chronology of the story this weekend for the Jerusalem Post, a remembrance article that lays out everything. Perhaps we can put that article in the chat box or a question and answer box, so folks can get the chronology if they want to look at it after my talk. But she tweeted the story out, and she's a spokeswoman for Amnesty International. And I noticed that, as well as some other Twitter chatter, but there weren't any stories really about Navid at that point. And I thought this is interesting because I cover the persecution of Iranians in the Islamic Republic and the Iranian regime's surveillance and assassinations of Iranians outside of Iran, especially on European soil and also in the United States, where Iran is highly active in assassinating and targeting dissidents for assassination. So the story interested in me, and then I wrote a summary of it based on the charges that were leveled against Navid, and they were two death sentences, which immediately piqued my interest because that suggests this is a very serious case, and the fact that it was, I believe, leaked to Amnesty and other human rights groups, or at least Amnesty, which does some very important work on human rights in Iran. I knew right away, instinctually, that the execution of Navid was moving at an astonishingly fast pace. So I just I had to scramble basically in to use the wrestling terminology to try to get this story out there and draw attention to his situation. He was charged along with his brothers with, quote, waging war against the state, corruption on earth, and forming anti-revolutionary group. Now the brothers are Vahid and Habib, and they're currently still in prison, and they've been tortured. Navid became the center of the case because, as I mentioned, he was charged with these alleged crimes. The real crime was the three brothers participated in a demonstration in 2018, not 2019, against the worsening economic climate and political corruption in Iran. Basically, it was a protest against the regime's economic and political corruption and mismanagement of the economy. This protest took place in Shiraz, which is about 400 kilometers away from the city of Tehran. It was, as I mentioned, a peaceful protest, but the regime said Navid and his brothers, specifically Navid, killed a security guard who was tracking protesters, a Basij security guard, a member of the Basij, which is the sort of a paramilitary group that serves to crap the whip against Iranians who show any type of dissident rhetoric or conduct. And the charge was nonsense. The real charge, as I mentioned, was simply the protest. The Navid was tortured to confess, according to human rights groups, Western governments, and also his circle of family member and friends, to confess, namely, that he killed the security guard. And he then acknowledged in the leaked tape, I was tortured. And these tapes, the recordings of Navid were, as I said, smuggled out of prison and also added to the case that he was framed by the regime. And as I mentioned, once Ben Askren, this wrestler, who's quite popular within the mixed martial arts world and wrestling community, tweeted my article, and at the time he had 349,000 Twitter followers. So the tweet went somewhat viral, and wrestlers and mixed martial artists picked up on it, and suddenly the story started to snowball. I noticed on Twitter. And then I write occasionally for FoxNews.com. I wrote a story for Fox News about the 2 death penalties imposed on Navid on September 1st. And a few days later, then President Donald Trump tweeted my article and quoted from it in 2 tweets that then sort of electrified the social media, but also the sports world and the mixed martial arts world, and helped draw more attention to the case, which had at that point had already drawn significant attention because prominent Iranian Americans like Masih Alinejad, who was recently targeted by the Iran for a kidnapping and likely assassination attempt, who lives in Brooklyn, also tweeted about Navid at the time. So the level of awareness increased, but obviously when the President of the United States tweets about a champion Greco-Roman wrestler who was about to be executed by the regime, it took on another level, and it captivated world attention like no other case involving an athlete in Iran in this century. So that's what played out. But leading up to his execution from roughly the end of August to September 12th, and as I mentioned, the remembrance day of his 1-year execution was this Sunday. A lot of activity took place, including US wrestlers, elite wrestlers, weighing in, posting videos on Twitter, on Instagram. These are medalists, who've won medals as world champions and Olympians like Kyle Dake, who was a 2-time world champion who weighed in, Thomas Gilman, who won a silver medal at the World Championship, Jaden Cox, who won a bronze medal at the Olympics, Sally Roberts, a woman wrestler who won 2 bronze medals. And then you had wrestlers from Germany, Canada, and other countries urging Iran not to execute him. Dana White, the head of the Ultimate Fighting Championship organization, who's a global personality with, I think, over 5 million followers on Twitter, issued a video in support of Navid. So this was a highly unusual international campaign because it entered the largely apolitical sports community, especially combat sports and wrestling, and it went international. It wasn't just the US. I was able to secure comments from the German government from my Jerusalem Post articles urging Iran not to execute Navid. A British minister weighed in saying don't execute Navid, put a stay on the execution. A member of the Azerbaijan parliament, an MP from an opposition party, told me Navid should not be executed, and I reported on that. So you could see there was a mushrooming process to put a stay on his on the execution. And what I found out just this week, or about a week ago, is that intelligence agents in intelligence officers in the Islamic Republic, I found this out via Iranian sources, said after the execution that this case was becoming too large. Navid was securing too much popularity, and that's why the regime executed him. I mean, we don't know if that's true because Iran executes the highest number of prisoners and political prisoners in the world, more than China per capita. So Iran is constantly engaged in a killing spree of dissidents. One only has to look at 2019, where Iranians flooded the streets to protest against the regime's economic and political corruption a year after Navid demonstrated, and the regime murdered 1,500 people. And of course, there are, scores of anonymous executions. So I don't believe that the regime murdered Navid in response to, for example, President Trump's tweet or other tweets. Obviously, they were dead. I believe they were going to move forward with his execution, and the fact that he was a wrestler, and wrestling is the most popular sport in Iran. Iran has won the most medals within Olympic competitions in the sport of Greco-Roman and freestyle wrestling. There are two types of wrestling. So it's a national pastime, that is wrestling. It's the equivalent of basketball and football and baseball in the United States. And Navid was a special human being in the sense that, all human beings are special, but in the sense that he wrote poetry, he was active in the field of women's rights. We found out later, protesting sort of against the hijab, the forced head covering. He was a source of great sort of euphoria and happiness for his family, according to his mother. And he was a very decorated wrestler who was extremely engaged with life in a way that when you look at the videos and other footage of him, you can see, and worked out with Olympic wrestlers. So this was an extraordinary human being who was executed at the age of 27. I would just like to read what his mother said on his remembrance. An Iranian American woman in California, Laudan Barzagan, whose brother was executed by the regime during the 1988 massacre. And Laudan is also a very special person who campaigns against anti-Semitism and the persecution of Iranians. And Laudan sent me this statement, which he translated from Bahi Namju, the mother of Navid Afkari. It's a short statement. She said, open quote, "People of the world today, I'm asking for your help. Last year, my son Navid, my lovely son, the hope of his motherland, died alone, hanging from the Islamic Republic of Iran's gallows, oppressed and helpless. It has been a year since Vahid and Habib, my other two sons, are thrown into solitary confinement. Vahid was ordered to speak against his brother Navid and condemn him so that he would be set free. Oh, human beings, why one day get together and write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Do you hear the painful burning of my heart? Do you know that this brutal regime has hunted, kidnapped, and tortured in the most inhumane way possible my innocent son for months, and has thrown him in solitary confinement in black holes to force him to confess to killing someone he had never seen or know? Even the Islamic regime of Iran's Office of Forensic Medicine has confirmed the injuries inflicted on my three sons as a result of torture. Do you know that from time to time, the bloodthirsty regime reaches out to life, love, and hope of a nation and kidnaps a zealous youth and kills him so that the wheel of his life, the wheel of his life spins with blood. As my lonely, helpless son Navid put it, open quote, this regime is looking for a neck for its rope, close quote. Is there a conscience left for human beings to lay their hands on the burning fire of my heart? Does humanity still make sense? Do humans not want to think for a moment, only to think that even today it's possible to plunder all of life, all the sweet and honorable moments of a family, all of its soul and spirit and existence, and then return the lifeless body of their beloved son to prove that this is the regime we do as we please? Isn't it time to put an end to silence and forgetfulness and hear the last cries of my beloved son Navid when he appealed to the people of the world last year and said, open quote, people, if I was executed, let everyone know that in the 21st century, despite having all the organizations of human rights and the United Nations and the Security Council, etc., an innocent man was executed while he was trying and fighting for his life, close quote. So she ended with this quote that's become very famous from Navid Afkari. It's obviously a very moving statement from the mother of Navid. She said a few days ago, I believe at the grave of Navid, there's video footage of them commemorating the remembrance of his death, or murder, I should say. This was not an execution, it was an extrajudicial killing. His father, Navid's father, spoke about his opposition to the dictatorship in Iran. So this is an unimaginable level of courage and bravery and sheer willpower from the Afkari family to openly voice their opposition to a totalitarian state when one of their sons, Navid, was murdered, and two of their sons are currently in prison and have been tortured. And their third son, Saeed Afkari, who was arrested on the day of the protest because of his opposition to the regime and then later released, has also been persecuted by the regime. Saeed followed me on Twitter, and I believe the regime shut down his Twitter account, which had a significant number of followers on Sunday. I'm not sure if it's up again, but Iranians don't have access to Twitter. Somehow we managed to circumvent that blockage. But you can see that this family has been, the Afkari family, and including the sister, has faced enormous persecution, and it's ongoing. And media attention, obviously, government sanctions can help, targeting the regime to stop this. The US government immediately, when Elliot Abrams was the special envoy for Iran in the Trump administration, immediately sanctioned Iran's prison and judiciary personnel who executed Navid, or murdered Navid, excuse me. So that was certainly helpful. The Biden administration could do much more, and certainly, and I'll end here, the sports world, I would argue, failed miserably. My view is that the World Wrestling Federation for Olympic athletes and amateur athletes, and the International Olympic Committee had a unique opportunity to stop the execution of this Olympic caliber athlete. Thanks to Richard Grenell at the time, the former U.S. acting national intelligence director, he told me at the time during my mad scramble to try to stop the execution, that the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, should investigate this and intervene in the pending execution. So Richard Grenell issued this statement to me. I sent it to the IOC. My understanding is that sparked an IOC investigation. The problem was the IOC and its the other wrestling organization, as they said later, did behind the scenes work. That was the phrase they used, instead of openly being transparent about the work and announcing at the beginning of their engagement with this regime in Tehran. This is my view, if those two organizations had said, if you, Hassan Rouhani, and Raisi, the current president of Iran, who was at the time the chief judicial minister who green-lighted Navid's execution, that is the current Iranian president, and if you, a supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, execute Navid Afkari, we will, the sports organizations, suspend you from the Olympics and all international sporting events. Had they said that, I'm supremely self-confident that Navid Afkari would be alive today, in prison, but alive. They didn't do that, and they worked behind the scenes. And as a result, a global athlete, Rob Kohler from Global Athlete, a human rights organization for athletes, sharply criticized the IOC, and then the organization United for Navid formed with Masih Alinejad and Sadar Pashai. That is after the execution. They started a campaign to bring awareness about Navid's case and force sports organizations to suspend Iran from international events, not only because of the execution of Navid, but also because of discrimination against Israeli athletes. And many of these elite Iranian athletes will deliver testimonies on the website of United for Navid. It's a brilliant website with tons of great information about how the regime in Iran told them you can't compete against Israeli athletes. So all of this developed, and there was a tremendous or just monumental interaction between Israelis and Iranians around the case of Navid. A broad-based coalition of different groups formed. And I'll just end here. One human rights expert told me after, when I spoke to this person, that if the campaign to save Navid's life had probably 2 more weeks, his life could have been saved. I'm open for questions, and thanks for carving out the time to listen. And yeah.
Ben, thank you. There was a lot in there that I think people did not know. Starting, by the way, with the fact that he has brothers, and the regime has been persecuting the brothers as well. So could you enlighten us? I'm going to get back to Navid in a second. Is there a similar campaign, is there a similar campaign on behalf of the brother to keep him in the public eye, to keep his situation in front of people? Part of it seems to me that Navid came to the public late in the process, but is there work being done now to try to save the brothers?
Well, the reason Navid's case surfaced late was because the Iranian regime clamped down, obviously, on news items and doesn't report on these cases, and it was leaked. That's my understanding. Very late. Obviously, I think, I'm of the view if you're on death row in Iran, if you're going to be executed in Iran, because their judicial process is a total sham, according to so many human rights reports, the family should try to get the information out as rapidly as possible. This case was, as I said, there was a crackdown there, probably because Navid's a wrestler, and the Iranian regime was aware that the public would mobilize around someone like Navid Afkari because he was an enormously popular figure and a wrestler, and it could create more unrest and shake the very foundations of the regime. Once the case became publicized, as I mentioned, late August, then it took off within a period of 3 weeks and became a international cause célèbre, as I mentioned, and it remains to this day. Navid Afkari is probably the only wrestler in the world that has this type of global name recognition. And aside from the sort of professional fake wrestlers like Hulk Hogan, but he's a real wrestler, and there's no one out there who has this type of name recognition within the authentic wrestling community, the authentic Olympic and wrestling community. His brothers Vahid and Habib were convicted and sentenced to 54 and 27 years in prison, respectively, and both condemned to 74 lashes. Now, there are efforts, and I've been reporting consistently on the developments about their cases in the Jerusalem Post, and United for Navid has been reporting about them, and Amnesty International just issued a very extensive report on the brothers and the torture they face in prison. But obviously, it's not enough. You need Western governments to, for example, at the nuclear talks in Vienna, to demand the release of all the Iranian political prisoners. I mean, my suggestion would be as an analyst, I would recommend that Rob Malley, the U.S. Special Envoy to Iran, and his counterparts with the other world powers, Germany, France, and Britain, that they sit down and demand that all these prisoners, including Americans and Germans and Austrians who have been taken hostage or imprisoned by Iran's regime, dual nationals, and other political prisoners like Vahid and Habib, be released before we commence any nuclear talks with Iran's regime. That should be a bare minimum. And that's where Americans and other people in countries like Germany and France and Britain can push their lawmakers and governments to push that. Obviously, resolutions in Congress, the House of Commons, the Bundestag certainly can help. All of this stuff to sort of up the ante about the case of Vahid and Habib Afkari should be utilized, including sanctions against the regime figures who are now torturing Vahid and Habib Afkari, and also calls for the regime in Iran to stop persecuting the mother and the sister of the family, the father, Saeed Afkari, who's being constantly persecuted. These, one has to shine a spotlight on the regime, and this certainly helps because the regime, as I believe, is experienced acute anxiety about this case and still does. And I should note that after this case took place, Iran International reported yesterday, a London-based outlet, that Iran's regime introduced heightened security measures to prevent the leak of reports about Iranian political prisoners, so they could prevent what happened with Navid in other cases. So that was an interesting report on the website of Iran International.
So sunlight, I remember when George Shultz was Secretary of State of the United States and he went to Moscow, and at his Seder, he read the names of Jews who were imprisoned for trying to leave the Soviet Union and go to Israel. And today, sadly, we mark the passing of Ida Nudel, who was, in the forefront of the Soviet Jewry movement. When the Jews were allowed to leave the Soviet Union, they all said it mattered to us greatly that the Secretary of State of the United States knew our names. So I think what you're saying is basically the same thing. We can't let up the pressure. However, I see our diplomats in Vienna don't even mention the names of US captives, let alone Iranian captives. So we need to what? We need to, how do we get them to focus? Do you have an idea?
Well, as I mentioned, I think the key is, pressure from American citizens who are engaged with their lawmakers and their representatives to urge them to, deliver speeches on the House floor in Washington or in state parliaments and city councils. There was actually, I believe, a city council measure to support Navid in either Los Angeles or Beverly Hills, somewhere in California, where there's a large Iranian American community, which I thought was quite remarkable when I was following this, that it actually his case reached the level of a city council. And of course, that helps draw attention when senators, obviously, and congressional representatives deliver speeches on the House floor and pass resolutions and urge the administration to confront Iran about its gross human rights violations. And then the sports communities, as I mentioned too, in pressure on the sports communities from lawmakers, not only in the United States, but other countries, can help. The IOC, the Soccer Federation, FIFA, the wrestling federations have been painfully apolitical about this case in terms of not sanctioning Iran. Just giving, again, there's been no penalty passed on Iran after they are executed, after they murdered Navid Afkari. So those are other areas. And lastly,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Lastly, I would obviously argue there needs to be much more media attention in major news organizations about Iran's targeting of athletes for murder, because Navid was not the only case. There have been other athletes who have been murdered by the regime, and his case just became a cause celeb. But there are other examples in other sports disciplines, including women. So that sort of I guess pressure point strategy certainly can help.
So then the burden falls on us. We have to do something about this, because clearly the regime hasn't really paid a price for this murder. Iran wasn't banned from the Olympics. Iran is not banned from international sports.
Right. In fact, the opposite happened, Shoshana. The Iranian regime allowed a marksman from the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, to participate in the Olympics. And this marksman won a gold medal, and the IOC praised him on Twitter. And Iranian athletes went, as you can imagine, were outraged and called for him to be sanctioned, stripped of his medal. This was an IRGC member, and the IRGC, of course, was sanctioned by the U.S. government as a foreign terrorist entity, who participated in the war against Syrians on behalf of Iran's regime and the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He was in Syria, and he won a gold medal as a marksman and was honored by the IOC. So the IOC, praised a terrorist who helped enable war crimes against Syrians, and at the same time opted not to sanction Iran's regime for murdering an innocent Olympic caliber wrestler.
Well, the IRC is not known as a bastion of courage because it hasn't said anything either to China about the Uyghurs or whatever. But you mentioned the talks in Vienna, and we have allies at the talks in Vienna. The French are our friends and allies. The British are our friends and allies. Russia and China are hanging around those talks also. Do they ignore Iran? Do they ever say anything? Do they just let it pass in hopes that it won't bother them?
Yes. I mean, Russia and China, as we both know, are totalitarian states, and they're not in the business of human rights promotion, especially in the Islamic Republic. And by the way, I wrote this in the Jerusalem Post analysis, if countries like Russia, which has a tremendous wrestling program, the best in the world, actually, the Iranians are in the top 3, but it had the Russian government or even the Russian wrestling team, but that's controlled by Vladimir Putin. So it would have to be the Russian, Putin's regime had intervened and said, don't execute this wrestler. Or Turkey, under Erdogan's authoritarian Islamic regime, had said, don't execute this wrestler, because Turkey also has outstanding wrestlers. Had they intervened, these countries with rich traditions of wrestling and that the Iranians look up to in terms of wrestling, that probably also would have likely saved Navid Afkari's life.
We could hope so, and obviously we won't know. But a listener asks a question. We have only so much leverage against the Iranian regime. How do we prioritize human rights, given that they're engaged in nefarious nuclear and terrorist activities that directly impact us in the West and that make us fear for our physical security in the future? How do we create a priority system that says the human rights of individuals in Iran versus the nuclear program?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think the defective approach to these nuclear talks is to separate the nuclear or the atomic weapons issue from the missile issue and human rights and terrorism. Irwin Cutler, a very distinguished jurist from Canada, who was the Attorney General in Canada and prominent human rights lawyer who represented, I believe, Nelson Mandela, if I'm not mistaken, right. Argued many years ago, when I remember reporting on him in Berlin, that there needs to be a comprehensive approach to Iran, whereas sort of a dialectical approach where these different elements are not separated, but a full package is given to Iran, that you need to radically improve human rights, stop murdering women and gays and athletes just because they protest or have a different sexual identity, etc. And you need to stop building long-term missiles. And of course, we know the United States government has labeled Iran the top state sponsor of terrorism because of their support of Hamas and Hezbollah and other terrorist entities. Iran has to stop that immediately. So, and then of course the nuclear issue. Iran needs to stop enriching uranium and pull the plug on its nuclear weapons program completely, and that has to be verifiable, et cetera, et cetera. All that needs to be part of one big package. And the only way to bring that about is to push lawmakers and congressional representatives and the current administration to link all of these different strands together as a comprehensive package.
Well, one can hope. So here's a question asking you to explain something that may or may not be right up your alley. We're watching the Taliban in Afghanistan, where you see a lot of terror being visited on the people of Afghanistan that has to do with promoting their form of religious practice. It's to keep people in line religiously and obey them religiously. How much of Iran's human rights abuses have to do with the regime staying in power, in other words, scaring the people and just frightening people to behave politically, and how much of it is based on religious dogma?
Yeah, well, I think there are obviously striking parallels between the Taliban terrorist movement's seizure of the Afghanistan government over the last month and the Islamic Republic of Iran, especially in the area of women's rights. Both terrorist movements, the Islamic Republic's terrorist movement in the early days of 1979 and 80, immediately introduced the most anti-woman and misogynistic policies that Iran has experienced in its history, its modern history. And the Taliban obviously are doing the same in terms of gender, apartheid, segregation of the genders, forced hijab, all these measures, child marriage. There's no shortage of horror stories. Both regimes demand intense loyalty to the radical Islamists who rule the regime, whether it's the regime in the Taliban or it's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who demands, by the way, loyalty from athletes, not to the government, but rather to the Islamic regime and his radical ideology. So there are those types of similarities, and Iran, the Islamic Republic, was along a pipeline. And I'm sure Tom Jocelyn, my colleague, talked about this, for sending pro-Taliban figures to kill American troops in Pakistan, Afghanistan. That is the Islamic Republic, and I attended a terrorism trial where I reported on this in Germany, involving the second 9/11 cell from Germany. That cell that formed after 9/11 was used by Iran allowed by Iran to travel through Iran and hosted by Iran, and then to wage war against American troops in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So there's obviously massive cooperation between these two, as I said, terrorist movements, because I see the Islamic Republic as a radical terrorist movement that is hell-bent on expanding its ideology, not only in the region, but also across the globe, because it is a revolutionary Islamic regime, similar to the Taliban. I don't buy this belief that what stays in Afghanistan, will stay there. Obviously, the famous quote about, to paraphrase one Russian thinker, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And the same holds true for terrorism. You may not be interested in Islamic terrorism, but Islamic terrorism, especially from Afghanistan and the Islamic Republic, are very interested in you.
Which is very frightening, actually. And therefore, my last question for the program, people who join us on a regular basis know that I like to try to end on a positive note. You have not given us many positive notes, but we're going to try to anyway. One of the things that was interesting to me in your remarks, we spend a lot of time denouncing human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, which pick on Israel in ways that are unfair and not factually grounded. But you had a lot of nice things to say about Amnesty International and its work on Navid Afkari. Is Amnesty an organization that you think of as a good human rights organization, or is it only good on this thing?
Well, I guess that my approach is quite pragmatic. I think Human Rights Watch, unfortunately, did a lousy job on Navid Afkari. And weeks went by without a statement, and they remained silent. And then on the day that Navid Afkari was murdered, Human Rights Watch sent me a statement and then publicized the statement. Amnesty, in the lead up to Navid's murder, was issuing statements to me, was calling for a stay of execution. So Amnesty I think has a very solid Iran program. Human Rights Watch has a lousy Iran program. I think they have one person who's largely not terribly effective and not willing to confront Iran's regime. Ken Roth, the executive director, who was embroiled in an anti-Semitism scandal a few weeks ago, who's accused of rightly, in my view, of stoking anti-Semitism on social media, and then had to delete his tweet, which speaks volumes about the tweet, has largely devoted resources into other areas, for example, attacking democracies like Israel and the United States, rather than pumping resources into their Iran program or into their Qatar program. So, Human Rights Watch got a $100 million donation from George Soros. How much of that money is going into exposing human rights violations in Iran? Practically nil. So their priorities are completely mixed up, and they're in the business of bashing democracies at the expense of, real human rights violations in totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. Garry Kasparov, the world famous chess player, has a good human rights organization and does very impressive work because he focuses on totalitarian and authoritarian regimes like Russia, like North Korea, countries that are where the resources should be pumped into. Amnesty. So I am a severe critic of Human Rights Watch, and people can read Robert Bernstein's famous op-ed in the New York Times from over a decade ago, where he denounces Human Rights Watch and Ken Roth for their misguided policy in the Middle East. I think the title of the op-ed was "Lost in the Mideast," and it's on the New York Times website. That's the founder of Human Rights Watch, who rejected the current approach. Amnesty, as I said, I disagree with their reports on, for example, targeting democracies, especially Israel. I do think it was an organization that was created to expose the persecution of political prisoners. I think they do a lot of good work, and I think, as I mentioned, they've done outstanding work on the Afkaris. I would like Human Rights Watch. I would wish, my wish is that Amnesty would devote the overwhelming majority, the bulk, I'm talking 99.9% of its work, to countries that are engaged in massive human rights violations, and there's no shortage of them. And Amnesty and Human Rights Watch could use their budgets for the rest of the next 50 years just to focus on countries like Iran and Qatar and Pakistan. There's no shortage.
And China. We like
no
to focus
shortage,
on
but
China.
The fact that they get sidetracked, including Amnesty at times, by countries like, and devote, I think, an excessive amount of work and resources and criticism to advanced capitalist countries that are democracies, traditional liberal democracies, liberal in the sense of, the John Locke notion, the Adam Smith notion, the classical liberal notion of democracy and liberty, like the United States, Britain, and other Western European countries, Canada, New Zealand, I think is incurably a misguided form of human rights engagement right now.
Well, that almost qualifies as an optimistic answer, because at least we've discovered that Garry Kasparov is out there and Amnesty does some good work. On that note, I want to thank you again for coming, talking to us, bringing us information that I really believe has been neglected by the media and neglected organizationally. So we appreciate it. We thank you. And for those of you who are listening, I know you have friends that couldn't make it. Lots of people can't make it at the last minute. This will be on the Jewish Policy Center website. So it's jewishpolicycenter.org. Send all your friends, wait till tomorrow, send all your friends to jewishpolicycenter.org to listen to Ben Weinthal tell you something you probably didn't know. Ben, we appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Shoshana.